The smell of jet fuel and morning coffee filled the briefing room at Nellis Air Force Base as Lieutenant Violet Lee adjusted her flight helmet one final time. At 28, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned early that actions spoke louder than words. Her father's dog tags hung beneath her flight suit, a constant reminder of Captain James Lee's legacy: 43 lives saved during 3 tours in Afghanistan. Before mechanical failure claimed his helicopter in 2019, Violet had grown up in military housing, raised by a man who believed saving people didn't require fanfare. Despite graduating summa cum laude from the Air Force Academy and scoring perfect marks on every written exam, she never fit into the boisterous pilot culture that dominated squadron social hierarchies. While others celebrated loudly at the officers' club, Violet spent evenings in her quarters, filling a worn leather journal with detailed analyses of flight maneuvers, weather patterns, and emergency procedures. The nickname Hummingbird had emerged 3 months into advanced training during a brutal thunderstorm simulation. While seasoned pilots fought crosswinds that sent their aircraft bucking like wild horses, Violet executed a series of micro-adjustments so smooth and precise that Captain Martinez, her flight instructor, remarked she moved like a hummingbird. Small movements, perfect control. But what started as genuine admiration quickly transformed into squadron mockery. "Here comes the little bird," pilots would sneer as she passed. "Does Hummingbird need help reaching the controls? Maybe she should stick to cargo planes instead." The jokes followed her to the mess hall, the simulator bay, even the base gym. Violet never responded, never defended herself. She simply kept training, kept improving, kept honoring her father's memory in the only way she knew how. Today felt different. The final evaluation session to determine combat deployment assignments loomed ahead. The test that separated real fighter pilots from academy graduates. As Violet reviewed her pre-flight checklist, she noticed unusual activity in the hangar. Ground crews whispered in clusters, and instructor pilots kept glancing in her direction with expressions she couldn't quite read. Major Gabriel Morris watched from the shadows near the equipment lockers, his weathered face betraying no emotion. At 46, Morris carried the weight of promises made to fallen friends, particularly one made 23 years earlier to a young rescue pilot named James Lee. "If something happens to me and she makes it through, will you watch over her?" James had asked during their final conversation at a dusty forward operating base. Morris had given his word, and he'd been quietly monitoring Violet's progress ever since. What he'd discovered surprised even him. Violet wasn't just competent, she was extraordinary. Her spatial reasoning scores ranked in the top 2% nationally. Her stress reaction times exceeded pilots with 5 years' experience, and her technical knowledge was encyclopedic. More importantly, she possessed her father's instinct. That indefinable quality separating good pilots from those who brought everyone home alive. The briefing room door slammed open, and conversation ceased immediately. General Roy Dalton strode in, his presence commanding instant attention from the 37 assembled pilots. At 52, Dalton was Air Force Royalty 200. Combat missions, 4 confirmed air-to-air kills, and holder of the high-speed spiral reaction course record for 20 consecutive years. His steely eyes scanned the day's evaluation roster, stopping abruptly when they reached Violet's name. A slow smile spread across his face, the kind that made junior officers nervous. "Hummingbird?" he announced to the room, his voice dripping with theatrical disbelief. "Did she get that name from ballet class?" The hangar erupted in laughter, harsh, cruel laughter that echoed off the metal walls. 37 pilots, 12 instructors, and 8 ground crew members joined the generals. Mockery of the quiet woman standing at attention. Violet remained perfectly still, eyes forward, no visible reaction. But inside, She felt the familiar weight of her father's dog tags against her chest, the same tags folded in an American flag and handed to her 3 years ago. Major Morris stepped closer to the general, his voice low but carrying authority. "Be careful, sir. Hummingbirds don't fly to show off. They fly to survive." Dalton glanced back with casual confidence. "We'll see about that, Major." But Morris knew something the general didn't. He'd read James Lee's classified after-action reports, documents detailing innovative rescue techniques that became standard procedure throughout Special Operations Aviation. Violet had been studying those same reports for 3 years, preparing, not just to follow her father's path, but to extend it. As the laughter finally died down, Violet was assigned to the most brutal evaluation in Air Force history, the high-speed spiral reaction course. Only 12 pilots had ever completed it successfully, with an average age of 34 and 8 years of flight experience. Violet had 18 months of active training. The weight of expectation, mockery, and legacy settled on her shoulders as she walked toward the simulator. Every step carried her closer to a moment that would either validate years of ridicule or prove that sometimes the quietest voices carry the strongest hearts. The advanced flight simulator bay hummed with electronic precision as Violet approached. The cockpit that would either make or break her military career. Sergeant First Class Williams, a 12-year veteran of flight simulation operations, performed his final equipment checks while stealing concerned glances at the young pilot. "Ma'am," he said quietly, leaning toward her as she adjusted her helmet. "Straps. Nobody under 30 has ever completed this simulation. The G-forces alone can cause unconsciousness. If you need to abort at any point," Violet looked him directly in the eyes, her voice steady despite the weight of 37 pairs of eyes watching from the observation deck. "Sergeant, my father flew real rescue missions in conditions worse than any computer can simulate. I'm not here to quit." Behind the reinforced glass, General Dalton settled into his viewing chair with the smug satisfaction of a man about to watch his point proven. He'd seen countless cocky young pilots humbled by the high-speed spiral course, and this would be no different. The quiet ones often crack the hardest when faced with real pressure. "Start the simulation," he commanded, his voice carrying easily through the intercom system. The massive curved screen surrounding Violet's cockpit flickered to life, displaying a nightmare scenario that had broken seasoned combat veterans. A Category 5 thunderstorm with 100-mile-per-hour crosswinds, zero visibility, simulated surface-to-air missiles, and a flight path requiring navigation through mountain valleys, while maintaining supersonic speed. The simulator chair began violent shaking as G-forces built rapidly. Most pilots would already be fighting nausea, their vision beginning to tunnel. Violet's breathing remained controlled. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. The technique her father had taught her during his final leave, 3 months before his death. "The body wants to panic, baby bird." His voice echoed in her memory. "But the mind can stay calm if you give it rhythm." From the observation deck, Lieutenant Commander Jake Peterson leaned forward with anticipation. Peterson had been writing Violet's case since day one of advanced training, convinced that Academy Honor students couldn't handle real combat pressure. "Watch this," he whispered to the pilot beside him. "She'll wash out in under 5 minutes." The first challenge appeared on Violet's screens. A 90-degree vertical climb followed immediately by an inverted spiral descent. The kind of maneuver generating 8 Gs of force and causing temporary blindness in unprepared pilots. Most trainees approached this section with visible anxiety, overcorrecting controls and fighting the aircraft instead of flowing with it. Violet pulled back on the stick with precise pressure, feeling the simulated aircraft respond to her touch. The transition from climb to spiral occurred so smoothly that her altitude variance measured less than 50 feet. A margin of error that impressed even the computer system. General Dalton stopped mid-conversation with his aide, genuine attention, replacing casual observation. In 20 years of holding the course record, he remembered his own first attempt at this maneuver. It had taken him 3 tries to achieve half the precision he was witnessing. The second challenge struck without warning. Complete engine failure during the spiral descent. In a real aircraft, this meant dead stick flying through a thunderstorm with 0 power and rapidly decreasing altitude. Standard protocol called for immediate ejection to preserve pilot safety. Violet's hands moved to secondary controls without hesitation. She'd practiced this exact scenario 237 times at Edwards Air Force Base, paying out of her own pocket for after hours. Simulator access. She knew which instruments remained reliable during power loss, how to read wind patterns through audio cues alone, and how to calculate glide ratios while inverted. Her powerless aircraft threaded through the simulated mountain valley with 15 feet of clearance on each wingtip. The control room fell silent. Even background chatter from ground crews stopped entirely. Lieutenant Commander Peterson's confident smirk faded. "That's not possible," he muttered. But Violet was just getting started. The third challenge materialized on her screens. The section that had defeated every pilot under 30 for 2 decades. Simulated missile attack while attempting emergency landing in 0 visibility. Radar showed 6 incoming projectiles. Standard evasive maneuvers would prevent safe landing, while staying on approach guaranteed simulated destruction. This was the puzzle that had stumped military aviation for 20 years, until Violet solved it 6 months ago during her private training sessions. Instead of choosing between evasion and landing, she executed a technique her father had pioneered. During combat rescues, a corkscrew descent using incoming missiles' own trajectory calculations against them. By descending in a precise spiral pattern, she created a moving target that forced the simulated missiles to overcorrect their flight paths, causing them to miss while she maintained landing approach. The technique required calculating missile speed, aircraft descent rate, and wind resistance factors simultaneously while pulling 6 Gs and maintaining consciousness. Violet's hands moved like she'd performed this maneuver 1,000 times, because she had. At exactly 14 minutes and 5 seconds, her simulated aircraft touched down safely. The radar system beeped. Simulation complete. Time: 14:05. New record established. The training facility remained completely silent for 30 seconds that felt like hours. General Dalton slowly removed his sunglasses, staring at the impossible numbers on his display screen. His 20-year record shattered by a 28-year-old lieutenant with a bird nickname. The silence in the simulation center stretched until Major Morris began a slow, deliberate applause. One by one, the entire squadron joined him, some with genuine admiration, others with the grudging respect reserved for witnessing the impossible. But not everyone was ready to accept what they'd just seen. General Dalton's jaw tightened as he processed the implications. 20 years of holding the course record, 20 years of being the gold standard for Air Force precision flying, ended by a pilot he'd openly mocked 15 minutes earlier. The humiliation burned, but worse was the growing realization that his judgment, his legendary ability to spot talent, had failed spectacularly. "Run it again," he commanded, his voice cutting through the applause. Violet climbed down from the simulator, removing her helmet with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. She placed it carefully on the equipment table, looked directly at General Dalton, and spoke quietly but clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Sir, I didn't fly that simulation to beat your record. I flew it to honor my father's memory. Captain James Lee, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. He taught me that real pilots don't fly for glory, they fly to bring people home." The hangar remained silent, except for the hum of cooling equipment, but Violet could feel the shift in atmosphere. Some faces showed newfound respect, others confusion, and a few, like Lieutenant Commander Peterson, displayed barely concealed resentment. As the crowd dispersed, Peterson cornered two junior pilots near the equipment lockers. "Lucky run," he said loud enough for others to hear. Probably had inside information about the simulation parameters. These academy types always find ways to cheat the system. The rumors spread with typical military efficiency. By evening chow, half the base was debating whether Violet's performance was legitimate or the result of academic privilege and insider knowledge. The other half was too busy studying her technique to care about the speculation. But General Dalton wasn't content to let rumors do his work. The next morning, he implemented what he called enhanced evaluation protocols for all advanced trainees. The new rules seemed neutral on paper, but were clearly designed to target Violet specifically. Effective immediately, he announced during the morning briefing. All pilots attempting record-level simulations must complete them under observation by a minimum of 3 senior officers. Additionally, any pilot achieving exceptional scores will be required to repeat their performance within 72 hours to verify consistency. Translation: Violet would be forced to repeat her record-breaking flight under intense scrutiny, with multiple opportunities for officials to find fault or technical violations. Major Morris watched from the back of the briefing room, recognizing the political maneuvering for what it was. He'd seen talented pilots destroyed by commanders who couldn't accept being outshone, and he wasn't about to let it happen to James Lee's daughter. That evening, Morris found Violet in the base chapel, the same back pew where her father used to sit during deployments. She was reading from a worn leather Bible, her expression peaceful despite the storm brewing around her reputation. "Your father used to sit in that exact spot," Morris said quietly, settling beside her. "Same Bible, too." Violet looked up, curiosity replacing concentration. "How do you know?" "Because I gave him that Bible before our first deployment." Afghanistan, 2003. Morris paused, measuring his words carefully. "There's something you need to understand about what happened today. General Dalton isn't just upset about losing a record. He's terrified of what you represent." "I don't understand." Morris pulled out a manila envelope marked "Classified, Eyes Only." "Your father wasn't just a rescue pilot, Violet. He was the rescue pilot, credited with developing 3 emergency techniques that became standard procedures. Awarded Distinguished Flying Cross twice, and holder of the high-speed spiral reaction course record from 2004 to 2007. Violet's hands trembled as she opened the file. Page after page detailed her father's innovations, his record-breaking performances, his reputation as the pilot other pilots aspired to become. "He held the same record I just broke for 3 years, until he deployed to Afghanistan and stopped having time for training competitions. The day he died, he was attempting to improve his own rescue response time, not for personal glory, but to save more lives during emergency extractions." The chapel fell quiet, except for the distant hum of aircraft engines. Violet understood now why her performance had triggered such strong reactions. She hadn't just broken a record, she'd continued a legacy that some people preferred to forget. "General Dalton served under your father briefly in 2005. Morris continued. "James broke Dalton's previous record, just like you broke his today. Some wounds never heal, especially when they involve wounded pride." Violet closed the file, her mind racing. "Why didn't anyone tell me this before?" "Because your father made me promise something. If you ever chose to fly, I was to let you find your own path. No pressure, no expectations, just opportunity." Morris stood to leave then. Paused. "But he never said I couldn't watch your back when the path got dangerous." As Morris walked away, Violet remained in the chapel, processing revelations that recontextualized everything: her training, her isolation, and the battles that lay ahead. She was no longer just a pilot trying to prove herself. She was the continuation of a story that powerful people wanted to end. Outside, Lieutenant Commander Peterson was already planning his next move, convinced that with enough pressure and scrutiny, the quiet lieutenant with the bird nickname would crack under the weight of expectations and reveal herself as the fraud he believed her to be. The next 48 hours transformed Nellis Air Force Base into a pressure cooker of speculation, resentment, and barely concealed sabotage. General Dalton's new enhanced evaluation protocols created an atmosphere where every aspect of Violet's training came under microscopic scrutiny. During her scheduled maintenance inspection, Lieutenant Commander Peterson discovered 3 minor technical violations in her pre-flight documentation: missing timestamps that had never been enforced before, signature placement inconsistencies, and failure to initial a secondary safety checklist that wasn't mandatory until the previous week. Each violation carried potential points deduction from her overall evaluation score. "Attention to detail, Lieutenant," Peterson said with satisfaction as he handed her the citation. "Real combat pilots don't cut corners on paperwork." The message was clear. They would use every regulation, every technicality, every possible angle to diminish her achievement and force her out of the program. But the real breaking point came during Thursday morning's briefing, when General Dalton announced the schedule for record verification flights. Lieutenant Lee will repeat her high-speed spiral performance this Friday at 0800 hours. Given the exceptional nature of her claimed achievement, we'll be conducting a full technical review of simulator systems, flight data, and pilot biometrics. The room buzzed with tension. Repeating a record-breaking performance under hostile scrutiny was nearly impossible. The psychological pressure alone had caused many pilots to fail attempts they'd previously succeeded. Violet maintained her composure, but privately wondered if this was how her father had felt when political maneuvering threatened to overshadow his actual service. She thought about the 43 people who were alive because James Lee had refused to let bureaucracy ground his dedication to saving lives. That afternoon, while reviewing technical manuals in the squadron library, she overheard 2 maintenance technicians discussing her upcoming flight. "Heard they're bringing in Colonel Andrews from Edwards to observe," one said quietly. "He's the guy who failed Lieutenant Rodriguez last year for irregular breathing patterns during her evaluation." "This whole thing stinks," the other replied. "Lee's the best pilot to come through here in years, and they're treating her like she cheated on a high school exam." The technicians weren't alone in their assessment. Sergeant First Class Williams, who'd operated the simulator during Violet's record flight, had been quietly reviewing the technical data. What he found troubled him enough to seek out Major Morris after duty hours. "Sir, I've run diagnostics on every system 3 times," Williams reported in Morris's office. "Everything functioned perfectly during Lieutenant Lee's flight. But I'm hearing rumors that they plan to question the simulator's calibration retroactively." Morris leaned back in his chair, recognizing the political chess game for what it was. "They're not trying to prove she didn't break the record, Sergeant. They're trying to create enough doubt to justify disqualifying her from combat deployment." "With respect, sir, that's bullshit. I've been running simulations for 12 years. And I've never seen anything like what she did in that cockpit. The girl's not just talented, she's gifted." Williams wasn't the only one paying attention. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez from Edwards Air Force Base called Morris that evening with disturbing news. "Major, I thought you should know. We've received 3 separate requests for Lieutenant Lee's simulator access records. Someone's digging deep into her training history, looking for anything that might suggest improper preparation or unauthorized assistance." Morris felt a cold anger settling in his chest. They were conducting a full investigation into a pilot whose only crime was being exceptionally good at her job. Who's making the requests? Can't say officially, but the paperwork traces back to Nellis Command. They're particularly interested in her after-hours simulator sessions and any conversations she might have had with technical personnel. After hanging up, Morris sat in his darkened office, staring at a photograph of himself and James Lee, taken during their final deployment together. His friend had faced similar political headwinds superior officers who couldn't accept that. A quiet pilot from Ohio could outperform academy favorites and career climbers. The difference was that James had Morris watching his back. Violet was facing this alone. Friday morning arrived with the kind of desert clarity that made everything seem sharper, more consequential. Violet performed her pre-flight rituals with extra precision, knowing that every action would be analyzed for signs of weakness or irregularity. As she approached the simulator bay, she noticed the unusual crowd. General Dalton had indeed brought in Colonel Andrews from Edwards, along with 2 additional evaluation officers and a technical review team. What should have been a routine verification flight had become a formal tribunal. "Lieutenant Lee," Colonel Andrews announced as she entered the control room, "given the extraordinary nature of your previous performance, we'll be monitoring not just your flight execution, but also your physiological responses, equipment interactions, and adherence to standard procedures." Translation: they were looking for any excuse to disqualify her performance before she even began. Violet nodded calmly, but inside she felt the familiar weight of her father's dog tags. She thought about his final words to her before his last deployment. "Baby bird, there will always be people who want to clip your wings because they're afraid of how high you can fly. Don't let them. The sky belongs to those brave enough to claim it." As she sealed her helmet and ran through final system checks, Violet made a decision that would define not just her career, but her entire understanding of what it meant to honor her father's legacy. She wasn't just going to repeat her record-breaking performance. She was going to shatter it completely. The moment Violet's hands touched the simulator controls, something shifted in the observation room. Her pre-flight sequence was flawless, not just competent, but demonstrating a level of technical mastery that made even skeptical observers lean forward with attention. Colonel Andrews, brought in specifically to find fault with her performance, found himself instead taking notes on technique refinements he'd never seen before. The way she adjusted her helmet's display settings, the precise pressure she applied to control surfaces, even her breathing pattern showed the hallmarks of someone who'd studied every variable that could affect performance. "Simulation initiating," Sergeant Williams announced, his voice carrying newfound confidence. He'd spent the previous evening triple-checking every system, ensuring no technical glitches could be used to question the results. The nightmare scenario appeared on Violet's screens, again Category 5 storm. 0 visibility, simulated missiles, mountain valleys requiring supersonic navigation. But this time, she approached it with subtle differences that only expert pilots would notice. Where her previous flight had been conservative in its excellence, this attempt pushed boundaries. She entered the vertical climb at a slightly steeper angle, executed the spiral descent with tighter rotation, and managed engine failure recovery while maintaining speeds that bordered on reckless, if they weren't so precisely controlled. Major Morris watched from the back corner, recognizing something familiar in Violet's approach. It reminded him of her father's flying style during their most dangerous missions. Controlled aggression that looked like recklessness to outsiders, but was actually the result of calculating risks so thoroughly that dangerous maneuvers became routine. "Jesus," whispered one of the evaluation officers as Violet threaded her powerless aircraft through the mountain valley with less than 10 feet of clearance on each side. "She's actually improving on her previous performance." General Dalton's confident smirk had vanished entirely. He'd expected pressure to degrade her abilities, anticipated that hostile scrutiny would reveal the flaws he was certain existed. Instead, he was watching a masterclass in precision flying that made his own 20-year record look pedestrian by comparison. The missile evasion sequence began, and Violet implemented her father's corkscrew technique with modifications she'd developed during months of private study. Instead of simply avoiding the simulated projectiles, she used their trajectory calculations to generate additional lift, actually improving her approach angle while simultaneously evading 6 incoming threats. At 13 minutes and 47 seconds, her aircraft touched down with a precision that registered as perfect on every measurement system. New record established, the computer announced. Time, 13:47. She'd beaten her own record by 18 seconds. The observation room fell silent until Colonel Andrews began clapping slowly. In 28 years of evaluating military pilots, he announced, I have never witnessed anything approaching this level of skill. General Dalton's face cycled through expressions of disbelief, anger, and something approaching fear. He'd built his reputation on being the standard of excellence, and in 2 flights, a 28-year-old lieutenant had made him look like an amateur. But Violet wasn't finished. As she climbed down from the simulator, she made an announcement that stunned everyone present. Sir, she addressed Colonel Andrews, I'd like to request permission to attempt the advanced combat scenario simulation. The room erupted in whispered conversations. The advanced combat scenario was a classified simulation used to evaluate pilots for the most dangerous special operations missions. It had never been attempted by anyone below the rank of major, and only 3 pilots in Air Force history had ever completed it successfully. Lieutenant, Colonel Andrews said carefully, that simulation is reserved for pilots with minimum 5 years combat experience. The psychological stress alone. With respect, sir, my father completed it in 1995 and again in 2006. I've been studying his approach for 3 years. Major Morris stepped forward from the back of the room. Colonel, Lieutenant Lee has been training on this specific scenario during her private simulator sessions. Sergeant Williams can verify her preparation level. All eyes turned to Williams, who nodded confirmedly. Sir, she's run modified versions of the advanced combat scenario over 200 times. Her success rate in training exceeded 90%. Colonel Andrews looked to General Dalton, who was trapped by his own previous statements about thorough evaluation. He couldn't refuse without appearing to play favorites or admit that his harassment campaign had nothing to do with maintaining standards. Very well, Andrews said finally. But understand, Lieutenant, this simulation has broken seasoned combat veterans. There's no shame in stopping if... Sir, Violet interrupted quietly. Stopping isn't in my vocabulary. As technical crews prepared the advanced simulation, word spread throughout the base. Off-duty personnel began gathering outside the simulator bay, drawn by rumors that something historic was happening. Even pilots from other squadrons found excuses to visit the Fayetteville area. Lieutenant Commander Peterson watched the growing crowd with growing unease. His campaign to discredit Violet was backfiring spectacularly, and he was beginning to realize that he'd underestimated not just her abilities, but the depth of support she was quietly building among enlisted personnel and junior officers. Chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez arrived unannounced from Edwards, bringing with him classified performance data that he handed directly to Major Morris. You're going to want to see this before she attempts the advanced scenario, he said quietly. Morris opened the file and felt his breath catch. The documents detailed Lieutenant Violet Lee's complete training history, including classified assessments that painted a picture of a pilot whose capabilities exceeded current Air Force evaluation standards. More importantly, They included a final recommendation from her father's commanding officer, written just days before Captain James Lee's final mission. If anything happens to me, please ensure my daughter receives every opportunity to exceed my own achievements. She has the potential to redefine what we consider possible in military aviation. As Violet prepared for the most challenging flight simulation in Air Force history, she carried with her not just her father's techniques and training, but his final blessing to push beyond every boundary that others tried to place around her potential. The real fight was just beginning. The advanced combat scenario simulation required security clearance adjustments that took 45 minutes to process, during which time the crowd outside the simulator bay grew to over 100 personnel. Word had spread beyond Nellis pilots from Edwards, drone operators from Creech. Even civilian contractors working on base had found reasons to be in the area. General Dalton watched the gathering crowd with growing alarm. What had started as a simple evaluation had transformed into something approaching a public event, and the implications for his reputation were becoming clear. If Violet succeeded when she succeeded, a voice in his head corrected, it would be witnessed by enough people to ensure the story spread throughout the entire Air Force. Colonel Andrews received a call from the Pentagon during the preparation. Colonel, I'm getting inquiries from air staff about unusual simulation activity at Nellis. Can you brief me on what's happening? Andrews explained the situation, including Violet's record-breaking performances and her request to attempt the advanced combat scenario. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. Colonel, are you telling me that a lieutenant with 18 months of experience is about to attempt a simulation that we typically reserve for special operations candidates? Yes, sir. And based on what I've observed, she has a legitimate chance of completing it successfully. Jesus Christ. Make sure everything is documented properly. If this goes south, I don't want any questions about protocol adherence. If it goes well... The voice paused. Well, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. While technical crews completed their setup, Major Morris pulled Violet aside for a private conversation. Your father attempted this simulation twice, he said quietly. Both times, he completed it, but the second attempt nearly killed him. The psychological stress is unlike anything you've experienced. Violet nodded, her expression serious but determined. What made it so difficult? It's not just the flying. The scenario simulates real combat conditions where you're responsible for extracting wounded soldiers under fire. Every decision you make affects simulated lives. The computer tracks casualty rates, mission success probability, even psychological stress indicators of the people you're trying to save. Morris paused, measuring his words. Your father told me that the hardest part wasn't executing the maneuvers. It was living with the knowledge that in real combat, hesitation or imperfection meant people died. The simulation makes that consequence feel real. How did he handle it? The same way he handled everything else. He prepared until failure wasn't an option, then trusted his training completely. As they walked back toward the simulator, Morris added quietly, Violet, there's something else you should know. General Dalton has been making phone calls. He's trying to get this evaluation stopped before you have a chance to attempt the advanced scenario. Violet's step faltered slightly. On what grounds? Safety concerns, protocol violations, anything he can use. He's desperate now, and desperate commanders make dangerous decisions. Sure enough, as Violet approached the simulator cockpit, General Dalton's voice cut through the preparation activity. Colonel Andrews, I'm formally recommending we postpone this evaluation pending a complete review of safety protocols. Allowing an inexperienced pilot to attempt this simulation could result in injury or equipment damage. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Every person in the room understood what was really happening, a senior officer using bureaucracy to prevent a junior pilot from demonstrating superior abilities. Colonel Andrews faced a moment that would define his own career. He could support Dalton's recommendation and avoid political complications, or he could maintain the integrity of the evaluation process, regardless of where it led. "General," Andrews said carefully, "Lieutenant Lee has met all technical requirements for this evaluation. Unless you have specific safety concerns based on equipment malfunction or procedural violations, I don't see grounds for postponement." Dalton's face flushed red. "Colonel, I'm advising you that this is not in the best interests of—" "Sir," Violet interrupted, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "With respect, I didn't request permission to attempt this simulation for personal glory. I requested it because the Air Force needs pilots who can handle impossible situations. If I can't prove that I'm capable under controlled conditions, how can I be trusted with real lives in combat?" Her words shifted the entire dynamic. This was no longer about records or personal achievements. It was about military readiness and the standards required for protecting American servicemen and women. Sergeant Williams stepped forward unexpectedly. "Sir, if I may," he addressed. "Colonel Andrews, Lieutenant Lee has spent more time preparing for this simulation than most pilots spend preparing for their initial certification. Her training hours and technical knowledge exceed standard requirements by significant margins." Other voices began joining the conversation. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez confirmed her preparation levels. Captain Martinez detailed her exceptional performance during basic training scenarios. Even maintenance personnel vouched for her technical competence and attention to safety protocols. General Dalton found himself isolated, his objections increasingly appearing motivated by personal rather than professional concerns. The political winds had shifted completely, and everyone in the room could feel it. Colonel Andrews made his decision. "Lieutenant Lee, you are cleared to proceed with the advanced combat scenario simulation." "General Dalton, your concerns are noted for the record, but I find no technical or safety grounds for postponement." As Violet sealed her helmet and performed final system checks, she could hear General Dalton speaking urgently into his phone in the corner of the observation room. His words were quiet, but his body language suggested he was calling in favors, making threats, doing whatever was necessary to maintain his position. But it was too late. The simulation was beginning, and whatever happened next would be witnessed by enough people to ensure the truth couldn't be suppressed or rewritten. Violet's hands found the controls, her father's voice echoing in her memory. "Baby bird, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's flying straight through it toward the people who need you most." The advanced combat scenario materialized on her screens, and with it, the opportunity to prove that excellence couldn't be diminished by politics, intimidation, or the fears of those who preferred their heroes to be less threatening to their own legacies. The advanced combat scenario began with a deceptive calmness that experienced pilots knew was a trap. Clear skies, perfect visibility, routine formation flying over simulated enemy territory. But Violet understood that the computer was measuring baseline performance before introducing the chaos that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. "Emergency alert," the simulation announced after 2 minutes of normal flight. "Friendly forces under fire. Grid coordinates 247851. Multiple casualties requiring immediate extraction. Surface-to-air missile systems active. Weather deteriorating rapidly." The peaceful flight transformed instantly into a nightmare of competing priorities. Violet had to navigate to the extraction point through increasingly hostile airspace while a thunderstorm system moved in from the west. The computer began displaying casualty reports, wounded soldiers whose simulated lives hung in the balance of her decisions. In the observation room, General Dalton ended his phone call with visible frustration. Whatever strings he'd tried to pull had failed to stop the evaluation. Colonel Andrews stood with arms crossed, watching displays that showed Violet's aircraft heading directly toward the most dangerous area of simulated combat space. "She's taking the direct route," one evaluation officer murmured. "Standard protocol. Calls for a safer approach vector, even if it takes longer." "Standard protocol assumes standard capabilities," Major Morris replied quietly. Violet's aircraft dove toward the extraction zone while surface-to-air missiles began launching from multiple positions. Instead of evading in a predictable pattern, she used terrain masking, flying so close to simulated mountains that enemy radar couldn't maintain target locks. It was a technique requiring split-second timing and perfect spatial awareness. "Jesus Christ," whispered Lieutenant Commander Peterson, his earlier skepticism replaced by grudging amazement. "She's flying combat patterns I've only seen in classified footage." The extraction zone appeared on Violet's screens, a narrow valley surrounded by enemy positions, with wounded soldiers pinned down under heavy fire. The computer displayed multiple options, each with calculated risk factors and casualty projections. Option A: safe approach from the south, minimal risk to aircraft, but 7 additional minutes flight time. Casualty projection: 3 wounded soldiers would die waiting for extraction. Option B: direct approach from the east, moderate risk, normal extraction time. Casualty projection: 1 wounded soldier might not survive. Option C: high-risk approach from the north, maximum danger to aircraft and pilot, but immediate extraction possible. Casualty projection: all wounded soldiers survive. Standard protocol demanded Option A. Career preservation suggested Option B. Violet's father would have chosen Option C without hesitation. So did she. Her aircraft banked sharply north, diving toward the extraction point through a corridor of simulated anti-aircraft fire. Warning! Alarms filled the cockpit as missile lock indicators painted her screens red. The computer calculated her survival chances at 12% and falling. But Violet had studied her father's classified mission reports, and she knew something the computer didn't. Impossible missions became possible when pilots stopped flying to survive and started flying to save others. She executed a maneuver that had no official name, a combat technique her father had developed during his most dangerous rescues. Instead of avoiding enemy fire, she used it. The trajectory calculations for incoming missiles became navigational aids, their predicted flight paths creating windows of safe passage that lasted only seconds. "What the hell is she doing?" General Dalton demanded, watching her aircraft seem to dance between explosions. "She's using enemy fire as tactical information," Colonel Andrews replied, his voice filled with professional admiration. "I've never seen anything like it." Violet's aircraft reached the extraction zone in 90 seconds, landing in a space barely large enough for a helicopter, much less a fighter jet. The computer registered successful extraction of all wounded personnel, then immediately introduced the next challenge: getting out alive. Enemy forces had surrounded the valley during her descent. Standard extraction routes were now blocked by concentrated fire. The storm system had arrived, reducing visibility to near zero, and her aircraft had sustained simulated damage that affected flight control systems. This was the point where the advanced combat scenario had broken other pilots. The psychological pressure of carrying wounded soldiers while navigating through impossible conditions had caused even seasoned veterans to freeze, abort, or make fatal mistakes. Violet closed her eyes for 3 seconds, a technique her father had taught her for finding calm in chaos. When she opened them, her hands moved with surgical precision. She executed a vertical takeoff that used ground effect and wind shear to generate lift despite engine limitations. As enemy fire converged on her position, she rolled inverted and flew backward out of the valley, a maneuver so unexpected that simulated enemy Tracking systems couldn't adjust quickly enough to maintain target locks. The observation room erupted in amazed chatter. Even pilots with decades of experience had never seen anything approaching this level of innovation under pressure. "Sir," Sergeant Williams called out, "all wounded personnel successfully extracted. Flight time from insertion to safe airspace, 4 minutes, 37 seconds. New simulation record by over 3 minutes. General Dalton's face had gone pale. He'd spent 20 years building a reputation as the Air Force's premier pilot. And in one morning, a lieutenant with a bird nickname had made his achievements look ordinary. But Violet wasn't finished. As her aircraft cleared the danger zone, the computer introduced one final challenge, the reason only 3 pilots in Air Force history had ever completed the advanced combat scenario successfully. Priority transmission, the simulation announced. Second extraction required. Additional friendly forces under fire. Grid coordinates 251973. Aircraft fuel critically low. Weather conditions deteriorating. Mission advisory. Return to base recommended. This was the test within the test. The computer was measuring not just flying ability, but command judgment under extreme stress. The simulation offered a perfect justification for mission completion. She'd already saved lives. Fuel was running low. Weather was dangerous. Any reasonable pilot would accept the recommendation and return to base. Violet looked at the fuel readings, calculated flight time to the second extraction point, and factored in weather conditions that would challenge even perfect aircraft in optimal condition. Then she turned toward the second group of wounded soldiers. "Negative on return to base," she announced to the simulation. Proceeding to secondary extraction. The observation room fell silent. Colonel Andrews stepped closer to the monitors, understanding that he was witnessing either the most heroic decision or the most reckless mistake in simulation history. What followed was 6 minutes of flying that redefined what observers believed was possible. Violet stretched fuel reserves through techniques that bordered on physics defying, navigated through storm conditions that reduced visibility to 0, and executed a second extraction that the computer had calculated as impossible. When her aircraft finally touched down at simulated base, the fuel indicators showed empty and the damage assessment looked like a maintenance nightmare. But every wounded soldier was alive and the mission was complete. Simulation complete, the computer announced. All objectives achieved. Flight time, 80 minutes, 43 seconds. New overall record established. Casualty rate, 0%. The observation room remained silent for a full minute as the implications sank in. Violet had not only completed the most challenging simulation in Air Force history, she'd completed it perfectly, faster than anyone before, while achieving the optimal outcome for mission success. General Dalton slowly removed his sunglasses and walked toward the simulator. His 20-year career of military excellence had just been eclipsed by a pilot he'd openly mocked hours earlier. Everyone in the room watched as he approached Violet, who was climbing down from the cockpit with her characteristic calm composure. "Lieutenant Lee," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent room. Violet stood at attention, meeting his gaze directly. "In 28 years of military service," Dalton continued, "I have never been more wrong about anything than I was about you this morning. Your performance today, ... He paused, struggling with words. "Your performance today represents the finest flying I have ever witnessed." He extended his hand. "It would be an honor to serve alongside you in any capacity." The handshake that followed marked more than reconciliation. It represented the passing of a torch from one generation of Air Force excellence to the next. The news of Violet's unprecedented performance spread through military aviation, circles with the speed of a classified emergency. Within hours, Her simulation results were being analyzed at the Pentagon, discussed in pilot training programs across the country, and forwarded to special operations commanders who specialized in impossible missions. But Violet herself had vanished from the base spotlight with characteristic efficiency. When reporters from Air Force Times arrived the next morning seeking interviews, they found no trace of the record-breaking pilot. She'd returned to her quarters, written in her journal, and prepared for the next day's training as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. The base commander had other plans. Within a week, Violet's photograph appeared in the main hallway of the operations center, not a publicity shot, but a technical image captured during her final spiral descent, showing her aircraft banking at exactly 37 degrees through conditions that would challenge seasoned test pilots. Aerospace engineers requested copies for training materials. The image became a case study in precision flying that was distributed to flight schools, military academies, and NATO training facilities. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. General Dalton requested a private meeting with Violet 10 days after her record-breaking flights. She found him in the same chapel where Major Morris had shared her father's classified service records, sitting in the front pew with a manila folder marked with her name. "Lieutenant," he began without preamble, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation." Violet remained standing until he gestured for her to sit beside him. 20 years ago, your father broke my flight record during a training competition. I was 32, he was 26, and I convinced myself that his success diminished my achievements." Dalton's voice carried the weight of long-held regret. "I spent 2 decades telling myself that records matter, that being the best pilot meant being better than everyone else." He handed her the folder. "These are your deployment orders. You've been assigned to the 24th Special Operations Squadron, the same unit your father served with during his most successful missions. It's the most elite rescue unit in the Air Force." Violet opened the folder, reading assignment details that represented the fulfillment of every goal she'd set since deciding to honor her father's legacy through aviation. "But that's not why I asked you here," Dalton continued. "I asked you here because watching your performance taught me something I should have learned years ago. Excellence isn't about being better than other people. It's about being worthy of the trust they place in you." He stood to leave, then paused. "Your father would be proud, Lieutenant. Not because you broke records, but because you proved that quiet strength can move mountains." 3 months later, Lieutenant Violet Hummingbird Lee received deployment orders to Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where she would support special operations rescue missions in some of the world's most challenging conditions. Her call sign remained Hummingbird, but now when pilots heard that name, they didn't laugh, they listened with the respect reserved for legends. Major Morris attended her deployment ceremony, carrying a letter that Captain James Lee had written to his daughter before his final mission, a cause letter he'd asked Morris to deliver only if she ever chose to follow his path into military aviation. "Baby bird," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've found your wings and chosen to use them in service of others. I never wanted to pressure you into military life, but I always hoped that if you chose it, you would fly higher and farther than I ever could. The quiet ones often carry the heaviest loads and achieve the greatest things, not because they seek recognition, but because they understand that real strength doesn't need to announce itself. Hummingbirds are the only birds that can fly backward, hover in place, and move in directions that seem impossible. They're small, but they're also fearless. Fly like a hummingbird, my daughter. Not to show the world how talented you are, but to reach the people who need you most. Records will be broken, achievements will be forgotten, but the lives you save will ripple through generations. Your father always." As Violet folded the letter, she understood that her journey had never been about proving herself to skeptics or breaking records held by those who underestimated her. It had been about becoming worthy of the trust placed in quiet people who choose to serve others despite having every reason to pursue easier paths. 6 months into her deployment, Violet successfully completed her first combat rescue mission, extracting wounded soldiers from a situation that had been deemed too dangerous for standard operations. Her after-action report was classified, but the soldiers she brought home were not. They returned to their families because a pilot with a bird nickname had learned to fly not for glory, but for the simple purpose of bringing people home alive. The night after that first successful mission, Violet sat in her quarters and opened her leather journal. On a fresh page, she wrote, "Today I understood what Dad meant about saving people. It's not loud, it's not glamorous, and the people you save will probably never know your name. But when you're flying towards someone who needs help, everything else records, recognition, respect, becomes background noise. Hummingbirds don't fly to be seen. They fly because the world needs small, precise, fearless things that can reach places others cannot." Below that entry, she added a single line that would guide the rest of her military career. Mission first. People always. Quiet strength forever. Sometimes the most powerful statements are made not with shouting, but with consistent excellence. That speaks for itself. Sometimes the people who change everything are the ones who never needed to announce their arrival. They simply showed up, did the work, and proved that legends are built not through self-promotion, but through service that echoes long after the applause fades. Lieutenant Violet Hummingbird Lee never became famous in the traditional sense, but throughout special operations aviation, her call sign became synonymous with impossible rescues, precision flying, and the quiet confidence that when Hummingbird was on the mission, everyone was coming home. And in the end, that reputation meant more than any record ever could. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.